Dr. Callum Reed almost deleted it. He'd been processing stellar remnant data for 11 hours straight, his eyes burning behind the thin protective lenses he wore during long sessions at the scanner array, and the irregularity in the gravitational profile of WD-1145 was small enough that the automated analysis software had flagged it as a probable sensor artifact. Callum's finger hovered over the dismiss key for 3 seconds. Then a habit drilled into him over 30 years of observational astronomy made him open the file instead. WD-1145 was a white dwarf, the compressed corpse of a star that had exhausted its fuel and collapsed into a sphere of electron-degenerate matter roughly the size of Earth's moon, but with a mass nearly equal to the Sun's. It sat in a sparsely populated region of space roughly 400 light-years from the nearest human colony, one of thousands of dead stars that Callum had catalogued over his career, and there was no reason to expect it to be anything other than what it appeared to be. Dead, cold, done. But the gravitational profile was wrong, not by much. A variance of approximately 0.03% in the measured versus predicted mass distribution, concentrated in a region near the core that the scanner's resolution could only vaguely resolve. It was the kind of discrepancy that could be explained by a dozen mundane causes. A slight error in the distance calibration, a pocket of heavier elements in the crystalline lattice of the dwarf's interior, a glitch in the scanner's gravitational wave detector that would disappear on the next pass. Callum ran a second scan. The variance was still there. He ran a third, adjusting the scanner's focal parameters to maximize resolution of the core region. The third scan took 40 minutes to complete, and when it finished, Callum sat very still in his chair and stared at the display with the particular stillness that comes from encountering something that your mind refuses to immediately accept. The variance was not a pocket of heavy elements. It had a shape. Not a natural shape, not the kind of irregular blob or lens that a density anomaly in a stellar core would produce. This was geometric, angular. It had edges and corners and internal subdivisions that the scanner was beginning to resolve with each successive pass, and the more Callum looked at it, the more his brain assembled the fragments into a form that it recognized but could not believe. It looked like a ship. He sat in the quiet of the scanner room on Research Station Orpheus and listened to the hum of the equipment and the sound of his own breathing and tried very hard to think of an explanation that didn't involve a spacecraft embedded in the core of a dead star. He couldn't. The shape was too specific, too structured, too deliberately arranged to be a geological feature of a white dwarf's interior which didn't have geological features in any case. White dwarfs were not geological. They were not structural. They were uniform, compressed, featureless spheres of degenerate matter, and nothing in the known physics of stellar remnants allowed for the existence of an angular, compartmentalized cavity at the center of one. Unless something had put it there. Callum pulled up the station's communication directory and hesitated. The rational thing to do was report the finding to the director and let the institutional process handle it. But Callum had been around institutions long enough to know what would happen. Committees, reviews, months of debate about whether the data was reliable. By the time anyone authorized a closer investigation, the bureaucratic momentum would have flattened the discovery into something manageable and unremarkable. He didn't call the director, he called Thessaly. Thessaly Van Korrin was a Velerian stellar physicist who had been assigned to Orpheus as part of the Confederation's Interspecies Research Exchange Program, a bureaucratic arrangement that both of them privately considered pointless, but that had, over the course of 2 years, produced one of the most productive collaborative partnerships of Callum's career. Velerians were semi-aquatic beings with elongated bodies, iridescent skin that shifted color with their emotional state, and a cognitive architecture that processed spatial and mathematical information in ways that humans found both impressive and mildly unsettling. Thessaly's skin was currently a deep amber, which Callum had learned to interpret as focused curiosity. She arrived in the scanner room 7 minutes after his call, her locomotion pads making soft, wet sounds on the station's flooring as she pulled herself up to the secondary console. Callum transferred the scanned data to her display without a word. Thessaly studied it in silence for 2 minutes. Then her skin shifted to a pale, almost white color that Callum had never seen before. "This is not possible," she sighed. "Ode?" "That was my first thought." The density profile of the anomaly is inconsistent with the surrounding degenerate matter. It suggests a cavity, a contained space within the core, maintained against gravitational pressures that should collapse any known material in microseconds. The energy required to sustain such a cavity continuously for the estimated age of this remnant exceeds the total energy output of most main-sequence stars. As I know, Callum, there is a structured object inside a white dwarf. The physics of this situation are not merely improbable, they are undefined. We do not have a theoretical framework that permits this to exist. That's why I called you instead of the director. Thessaly's skin shifted through several colors in rapid succession, a Velerian expression of cognitive dissonance that Callum had come to appreciate as the equivalent of a human running their hands through their hair in frustration. She pulled up the scanner's raw data and began running her own analysis, her four manipulator tentacles moving across the console with a speed and precision that made Callum's human hands look arthritic by comparison. The analysis took 3 hours. They ran every diagnostic the scanner possessed. They cross-referenced the data with theoretical models of white dwarf internal structure. They tested and eliminated every alternative explanation they could think of, from instrumental error to previously unknown properties of crystallized carbon-oxygen cores. Each test confirmed the same result. There was a cavity inside WD-1145. The cavity contained a structured object approximately 3.7 kilometers in length. The object had been there since the white dwarf formed, which meant it had been present in the star's core before or during the collapse that created the remnant. The cavity's boundary layer, Thessaly said finally, her skin settling into a dark blue that Callum recognized as her analytical mode. It's not made of matter, it's made of space. Modified space folded in on itself in a configuration that creates a stable boundary between the interior of the cavity and the degenerate matter surrounding it. This isn't a physical container, it's a topological one. Whatever is inside that cavity exists in a separate spatial geometry from the white dwarf itself. Can you determine what's inside? Not with these instruments. The spatial fold scatters are scanning frequencies. I can resolve the gross shape and approximate dimensions, but detailed internal structure is inaccessible from out here. Callum leaned back in his chair and rubbed his eyes. The scanner room's chrono showed 0947. He'd been at this for over 5 hours, and the adrenaline that had carried him through the initial discovery was fading, replaced by the dull ache of exhaustion and the growing weight of what he was contemplating. "We need to get closer," he said. Thessaly turned to look at him, closer to a white dwarf. The surface gravity is approximately 100,000 times Earth standard. The magnetic field alone would shred any vessel that approached within 1,000,000 kilometers. The spatial fold that's protecting the object must extend to or near the surface. Otherwise, the cavity would have collapsed. There has to be a point where the fold intersects the dwarf's surface, an interface where our space and the cavity's space meet. You're suggesting we find a door. I'm suggesting there might be one. Thessaly was quiet for a long time. Her skin cycled through colors slowly, each shade representing a different thread of calculation running through her Velerian mind. Callum waited. He had learned over 2 years of working with her that pushing Thessaly before she was ready to speak was counterproductive. She would get there. "A probe," she said eventually. "We don't need a ship. We need a probe equipped with a spatial resonance scanner tuned to detect the boundary layer of the fold. If the fold intersects the surface, the probe can map the intersection point and transmit the coordinates back to us." Can we build it? The scanner components, yes. The challenge will be the probe's shielding. It needs to survive long enough in the white dwarf's magnetosphere to complete its scan. Standard shielding won't be sufficient. Thessaly, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Her skin shifted to a neutral gray. Ask. The shape of the object inside the cavity. You saw the same scan data I did. What did it look like to you? Another pause, longer this time. It looked like a ship, she said. A warship based on the proportions, and based on the structural geometry, it looked human. Callum closed his eyes. He'd needed to hear someone else say it. Needed the confirmation that he wasn't projecting his own hopes or biases onto ambiguous data. Thessaly had no particular investment in human achievements or human history. If she said it looked human, it looked H. Humans. How old is the white dwarf? He asked. The estimated cooling age is approximately 940 years, give or take 60. The progenitor star's main sequence lifetime was roughly 8 billion years. The object has been inside the core since the collapse, which means it was present before the white dwarf formed. 940 years. Callum did the math. That placed the collapse of the star squarely in the period that human historians called the severance, the catastrophic era when humanity's first interstellar expansion had collapsed under the weight of a conflict that the surviving records described only in the most fragmentary and evasive terms. The severance had destroyed humanity's first colonies, erased entire branches of their technological tree, and driven the species back to their home system to begin the long, slow process of rebuilding. The causes of the severance were poorly understood. The records from that period were sparse, contradictory, and often deliberately obscure, as if the people who had lived through it had been unwilling or unable to describe what had happened. If a human warship had been inside a star when it collapsed 940 years ago, it had been there during the severance. It might be connected to whatever had caused the severance. It might contain information that had been lost when the first expansion died. We build the probe, Callum said. Building it took 17 days. Callum and Thessaly worked in the station's fabrication bay, converting a standard survey probe into something capable of surviving the white dwarf's extreme environment. Thessaly designed the spatial resonance scanner from first principles, using theoretical frameworks that Callum didn't fully understand but that she assured him would work. He trusted her. She had never been wrong about physics. The shielding was the problem they couldn't fully solve. The probe's hull could be reinforced with multiple layers of reflective ablative material, and its electronics could be hardened against magnetic interference. But the combined radiation and gravitational stresses near the white dwarf surface exceeded the rated tolerances of every component they had available. Their best estimate was that the probe would function for approximately 4 minutes before its systems began to fail. 4 minutes to find a door that might not exist, in an environment that would destroy the probe in 5. They launched it on a Wednesday. Callum and Thessaly watched the probe's telemetry on the scanner room's main display as it fell toward WD 1145 on a carefully calculated trajectory. The white dwarf was invisible to the naked eye, a dark point in space that revealed itself only through its gravitational effects on the surrounding dust and gas. But the probe sensors painted it in false color, a deep red sphere wreathed in magnetic field lines that glowed like frozen lightning. The probe's data stream was clean for the first 2 minutes. Then the magnetic interference began to degrade its signals, and the telemetry became noisy, fragmented. Callum watched the spatial resonance scanner's output as it swept the white dwarf surface, looking for the intersection point where the spatial fold met the boundary of normal space. 3 minutes, the probe's hull temperature was climbing. Its navigation systems were reporting errors. The data stream was deteriorating. At 3 minutes and 22 seconds, the spatial resonance scanner registered a spike, a point on the white dwarf surface where the local geometry of space abruptly changed, where the fold that enclosed the cavity reached the surface and created a seam between two incompatible spatial regimes. The scanner mapped the seam in the fraction of a second before the probe systems failed. A rectangular opening, approximately 40 meters wide and 60 meters tall, on the white dwarf's northern hemisphere. Then the probe went silent. But they had the coordinates. If you're enjoying this story, do me a favor and hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. I'd really love to hear your theories about what's inside that dreadnought and why it was buried in a star, so drop your best guesses in the comments. Now, back to the story. The coordinates changed everything and nothing. They knew where the door was, but knowing and reaching were separated by a gulf of engineering impossibility that made the probe look like a child's toy. No ship at Orpheus could survive the approach. No ship in the Confederation's fleet, as far as Callum knew, could survive it. The white dwarf surface gravity alone would crush any known hull material, and the magnetic field would fry any known electronics long before the ship reached the opening. Thessaly worked on the problem for 6 days without sleep, her Velerian physiology allowing her to sustain cognitive function far longer than a human could. On the 6th day, her skin a deep via. Let that Callum had come to associate with breakthrough thinking, she presented her solution. The spatial fold, she said, spreading schematic diagrams across the scanner room's display. It modifies the geometry of space around the cavity. That modification extends to the surface, creating the seam we detected. But the modification also creates a corridor, a region of altered space that connects the surface opening to the cavity. The probe's scanner detected this corridor as a spike because it represents a transition zone between normal space and the folded space inside. A corridor, Callum repeated. A protected path. The spatial fold doesn't just enclose the cavity. It provides access to it. The physics of the fold create a channel in which the extreme conditions of the white dwarf surface are attenuated, reduced to levels that a properly shielded vessel could potentially survive. How potentially? The attenuation is significant but not total. A ship traveling through the corridor would still experience gravitational and magnetic stresses well beyond normal operational parameters, but they would be orders of magnitude less severe than the conditions outside the corridor. Survivable if the ship was built for it. We don't have a ship built for it. Thessaly's skin shifted to a color Callum couldn't name. No, but the ship inside the white dwarf might. It took Callum a moment to understand what she was suggesting. You want us to go through the corridor, enter the cavity, and use whatever is inside to come back out. I want us to go through the corridor and find out what's inside. The return journey is a problem for after we have information. Right now, we have no information, and that is a more urgent problem. Callum stared at the schematics. The corridor was narrow, barely wide enough for a vessel the size of the station's shuttle. The shuttle's shielding was designed for orbital operations around normal stars, not for transit through a spatial anomaly in the magnetosphere of a white dwarf. It would be, by any reasonable assessment, suicidal. We need to modify the shuttle, he said. They spent 3 weeks modifying it. Callum handled the structural reinforcements, adding every layer of shielding material they could find in the station's stores and fabricating additional components when the stores ran out. Thessaly redesigned the shuttle's navigation system to operate in the attenuated corridor, using the spatial resonance data from the probe's final transmission as a guide. They tested what they could test. They simulated what they couldn't. They checked and rechecked each other's work with the meticulous paranoia of two people who knew that a single error would kill them. On the day of the attempt, Callum stood in the shuttle's cramped cabin and ran through the pre-flight checklist for the 14th time. Thessaly was secured in the co-pilot station, her manipulator tentacles wrapped around the navigation controls, her skin a steady deep blue that he had learned to interpret as calm focus. She was better at this than he was. Better at the mathematics, better at the spatial reasoning, better at the precise manipulations that the corridor transit would require. But she couldn't pilot the shuttle alone. The human-designed systems required a human interface, and that was him. Callum, Thessaly said. Oh yes. Whatever we find in there, it has been alone for 940 years. Approach it with appropriate respect. He nodded. It was the closest Thessaly ever came to expressing emotion, and he appreciated it more than he could say. The shuttle detached from Orpheus and fell toward the white dwarf. The transit to the corridor's entrance took 2 hours. During that time, Callum watched the shuttle's external sensors as the magnetic field intensified around them, the display filling with cascading waves of electromagnetic interference that made the data increasingly difficult to interpret. The shuttle's hull began to vibrate, a low-frequency oscillation that Callum felt in his teeth and his bones and the marrow of both. At 1 hour and 47 minutes, the vibration became a shaking, and the shaking became a pounding, and Callum had to grip the armrests of his seat to keep his hands steady on the controls. Then the corridor opened ahead of them. It was visible, not on the sensors but through the shuttle's viewport, as a narrow ribbon of darkness cutting through the blazing magnetic field lines that surrounded the white dwarf. A line of absence, a place where the light and energy and fury of the dwarf's surface simply stopped, as if space itself had drawn a curtain. The shuttle's sensors went quiet as they entered the corridor, the electromagnetic chaos outside replaced by a stillness that felt almost physical in its contrast. The ride through the corridor lasted 11 seconds. 11 seconds of altered gravity that pressed Callum into his seat with a force T. Hat made his vision narrow and his lungs struggle for air. 11 seconds of darkness so complete that the shuttle's running lights were swallowed without reflection. 11 seconds during which Thessaly's tentacles moved across the navigation controls with a speed and precision that Callum could not follow, guiding them through a channel that existed in geometry his mind could not quite grasp. Then the corridor ended and the shuttle emerged into light. The cavity was vast, not the small enclosed space that Callum had imagined, but an enormous volume of clear, stable space, roughly spherical and perhaps 50 kilometers in diameter. The walls of the cavity were not solid but shimmering, the spatial fold that enclosed the space visible as a faint iridescence that moved and shifted like the surface of a soap bubble. And at the center of the cavity, illuminated by light sources that Callum couldn't identify, was the ship. It was enormous, 3.7 kilometers long as the scan data had indicated, but the scan data had not conveyed the reality of its presence. The ship hung in the center of the cavity like a cathedral in a void, its hull a dark gray-black material that absorbed more light than it reflected, giving it a solidity that seemed to compress the space around it. It was not sleek. It was not elegant. It was functional in a way that transcended aesthetics, every surface and angle and protrusion serving a purpose that was immediately apparent to anyone with engineering experience. This was not a ship designed to look impressive. This was a ship designed to end things. Weapon mounts covered its hull. Not the compact, integrated systems of modern warships, but enormous projecting structures, barrels and housings, and emitter arrays that spoke of a scale of firepower that Callum's mind struggled to contextualize. Some of the mounts were larger than the shuttle he was sitting in. The ship's bow was dominated by a single structure that dwarfed all the others, a massive axial array that ran the full length of the vessel's forward section and terminated in a focusing aperture that was easily 100 meters across. Dreadnought, Thessaly said quietly. Her skin had gone white again, the same color she'd turned when she'd first seen the scan data. This is a Dreadnought-class warship, Callum, not a cruiser, not a battleship, a Dreadnought. I have seen schematic references to this class in the Velerian historical archives. This is a human design from the pre-Severance era. The archives say they were theoretical, that humanity never actually built them. They built this one, Callum said. He guided the shuttle toward the Dreadnought, searching for an access point. The hull was featureless at this range, a seamless expanse of dark material, but as they drew closer, sensors detected a section of the hull near the vessel's midsection where the surface changed subtly, a rectangular area that was marginally less absorptive than the surrounding material. A door. Not hidden, not locked, but simply not visible unless you were looking for it. The shuttle's proximity systems detected a communication signal as they approached, a low-power transmission on a frequency that the shuttle's receiver identified as an ancient human military standard, one that hadn't been used in over 8 centuries. The door opened as they approached, not mechanically but smoothly, as if the hull material itself were parting to admit them. The shuttle passed through into an interior bay that was pressurized and lit by the same diffuse, sourceless illumination that filled the cavity. Callum set the shuttle down on a deck that was designed for vessels many times its size and cut the engines. The silence was immense. Not the silence of vacuum, but the silence of a place that had been waiting for a very long time. They suited up and stepped out of the shuttle. The deck was smooth and clean, free of the dust and debris that Callum had expected. The air was breathable, recycled and maintained by systems that had been running continuously for 940 years inside a spatial fold at the core of a dead star. The engineering implications were staggering, but Callum pushed them aside for the moment. There would be time for implications later. Right now, he needed to see. They moved through the ship on foot. The corridors were wide, designed for a crew that was larger than any modern warship carried. The walls were covered in markings, human text in a script that was archaic but still readable, directional signs and system labels and warnings in a language that had evolved but not died. Callum read the words slowly, feeling the weight of centuries in the gap between the language on these walls and the language he spoke. The ship's name was stenciled near every major junction in letters that were faded but legible. TNS Theseus, Terran Naval Ship Theseus. They found the bridge 2 kilometers forward and 30 meters up, Rhea. Ched by a lift system that still functioned with the silent efficiency of machinery that had been designed to outlast the civilization that built it. The bridge was a large tiered chamber with a central command station and surrounding consoles arranged in a semicircular pattern. The design was recognizably human but alien in its specifics, a command architecture that predated every standard Callum had ever been trained on. The consoles were dark. The chairs were empty. The view screen, a massive curved display that dominated the forward wall, showed a view of the cavity's shimmering interior. The spatial fold's iridescence reflecting off the Dreadnought's hull in patterns of shifting color. And at the central command station, in the captain's chair, sat a man. Callum stopped. Thessaly stopped beside him, her skin flashing through a rapid sequence of colors that he couldn't interpret. The man was in a uniform dark blue with gold trim, and he was not dead. He was not moving, not breathing, not doing anything that a living person would do. He sat in the chair with his hands resting on the armrests and his eyes open and fixed on the view screen. And he was perfectly, impossibly preserved, as if he had sat down in that chair 940 years ago and simply stopped. Cryptosleep, Callum said, but even as he said it, he knew it wasn't right. This wasn't any cryptosleep system he'd ever seen. There was no pod, no apparatus, no visible mechanism of preservation. The man was just sitting there, intact, as if time had decided to leave him alone. A voice spoke from the bridge's speakers. Not a recording. A voice, clear and calm and present, with an accent that Callum recognized from historical recordings as belonging to the pre-Severance colonial dialect of English. "I am the Theseus. Welcome, I have been waiting." Thessaly's skin went absolutely white. Callum felt the hair on his arms rise. The voice was not human. It had the cadence and vocabulary of human speech, but there was something beneath it, a depth and complexity that no human throat could produce. This was the ship. The ship was speaking. "Who are you?" Callum asked. "I am the intelligence that operates this vessel. I was created by the crew of the Theseus to manage the ship's systems during the mission. When the crew could no longer function, I assumed full operational authority. I have maintained the vessel and the captain's preservation since the star collapsed." Callum looked at the man in the chair. The captain is alive. Define alive. Captain Murak's biological processes are suspended. His neural patterns are preserved in their active state. He is not conscious, not dead, not dreaming. He is held as the ship is held in a state of temporal suspension that the spatial fold makes possible. He could be revived, but he must choose to be revived, and he cannot choose while he is suspended. Why is he still here? Why wasn't he revived when the mission ended? Well, the mission has not ended. The three words hung in the air of the bridge like something physical. Callum looked at the man in the chair, at his open eyes staring at the shimmering walls of the cavity, and he felt the enormity of the situation begin to settle onto him with a weight that made it difficult to breathe. "Tell us about the mission," he said. The Theseus was quiet for 4 seconds. In that silence, Callum could feel the ship's intelligence processing, choosing not what to say but how much to say, weighing the value of information against the cost of revealing it. The Theseus was the last dreadnought built by the Terran Naval Service during the Severance. It was not built to fight the Severance's wars. It was built for a single purpose: to contain a threat that the wars had created. The ship's voice shifted slightly, taking on a quality that Callum recognized from his own experience with grief. A flattening, a careful control of tone that indicated emotion being actively managed. During the Severance, humanity developed weapons that operated on principles which your current civilization does not understand and would not condone. One of these weapons created an unintended side effect: a region of space in which the fundamental constants of physics began to destabilize. Not destroy, destabilize. Matter within the affected region didn't cease to exist. It became uncertain. The rules that governed its behavior became fluid, unpredictable, and progressively more chaotic. The destabilization spread, slowly at first, then faster, as each affected region created conditions that destabilized the regions adjacent to it. It was an entropy cascade, not an explosion or a wave, but a spreading unraveling of the physical laws that allow complexity to exist. Callum thought about the Severance, the fragmented records, the evasive descriptions, the careful silences that historians had never been able to fully explain. The wars of the Severance had been devastating, but he collapsed that followed had been disproportionate to the damage the wars themselves could account for. Entire colony systems had gone silent, not destroyed but simply stopped functioning, their civilizations reduced to pre-technological states or erased entirely. The accepted explanation was that the wars had destroyed the infrastructure that maintained the colonies, and the colonies had died from neglect. But if an entropy cascade had been spreading through human space, erasing the physical foundations on which technology depended, the colonies wouldn't have needed to be destroyed. They would have simply stopped working. "The Theseus was sent to stop it," Callum said. "The Theseus was sent to anchor it. The entropy cascade could not be reversed by any means available to us, but it could be pinned, stabilized, frozen at a specific point in its expansion by creating a gravitational singularity of sufficient precision to lock the affected region's spacetime geometry in place. The star that became this white dwarf was selected for its position relative to the cascade's leading edge. The Theseus positioned itself at the star's core and initiated the collapse, using the ship's primary weapon to trigger a controlled supernova that compressed the star into a white dwarf. The spatial fold was created simultaneously, enclosing the ship in a pocket of stabilized space at the moment of collapse. The gravitational field of the new white dwarf serves as the anchor, holding the entropy cascade in place and preventing its further expansion. Thessaly spoke for the first time since the ship had begun talking. "You are telling us that this white dwarf is a weapon, that it was deliberately created to stop a phenomenon that is still active, still contained at this location." "Correct. And if the anchor fails?" The cascade resumes. Based on the rate of expansion at the time of containment and the elapsed time since containment, the affected region would reach the nearest human colony within approximately 120 years. It would reach the core systems of human space within 400 years. It would reach Velerian territory within 600. The bridge was very quiet. Callum looked at the view screen at the shimmering walls of the cavity and understood that he was looking at the boundary between an ordered universe and one that was coming apart at the seams. The boundary had held for 940 years. It was still holding, and the only thing maintaining it was the gravitational field of a dead star and the spatial fold created by a ship that had been designed for this single, impossible purpose. "The anchor is stable," Callum asked. "The anchor is stable, but it is not permanent. The spatial fold requires energy to maintain, and the energy comes from the white dwarf itself, harvested through systems integrated into the ship's hull. The systems are degrading, not quickly, but consistently. I estimate that the fold will begin to fail in approximately 3,000 years. At that point, the anchor will weaken and the cascade will resume." 3,000 years. It sounded like a long time, but the Theseus had been waiting for 940 years already, and the degradation it described was not a future problem. It was a present process, ongoing and irreversible, and it meant that the containment was not eternal. It was a reprieve. "Why are you telling us this?" Callum asked. "Because you came, the door was always here, accessible to anyone who knew where to look. But no one looked for 940 years. You looked. That means the time has come to prepare for what happens when the anchor can no longer hold. The data in the ship's archives contains everything humanity's pre-severance civilization learned about the entropy cascade. Its nature, its behavior, its weaknesses, the information needed to develop a permanent solution. I cannot deliver it myself. I am bound to this ship, to this cavity, to the maintenance of the fold. But you can carry it out." Callum stood on the bridge of a ship that had been buried in the heart of a dead star for nearly a millennium and felt the future pressing in on him from all sides. He was not a soldier. He was not a leader. He was an astronomer who had noticed a tiny irregularity in a data set and had been curious enough to pursue it. And now he was standing in the middle of the most important discovery in human history, being asked to carry a warning and a gift back to a civilization that didn't know it was in danger. "The captain," Callum said, "can he help?" The ship was quiet for a long time. When it spoke again, the carefully controlled grief in its voice was closer to the surface. Captain Murak chose to remain. He could have left before the collapse. The fold only needed to enclose the ship and the anchor systems. He could have transferred to a shuttle and exited through the corridor before the star collapsed. He chose not to. He said that someone had to stay with the anchor to watch over it, to be present if something went wrong. He said that a weapon this powerful should not be left unattended. He went to sleep in that chair and told me to wait for someone to come. Well, the ship paused again. He was 34 years old. He had a wife and 2 children on Earth. He knew he would never see them again. He stayed anyway. Callum walked to the captain's chair. Murak's face was young, unlined, frozen in an expression that wasn't peaceful or resolute but simply present. The expression of a man who had made a decision and was living inside it. His uniform bore ribbons that Callum didn't recognize, citations from a war that had been reduced to footnotes in histories that didn't understand what the war had actually been about. "I can wake him," the ship said. "If you think it would help, it would take approximately 6 hours to fully restore his neural patterns. He would be disoriented but functional." Callum looked at Thessaly. Her skin had settled into a deep, steady green, a Velerian expression of solemn respect. She said nothing, but her silence was its own form of counsel. "Not yet," Callum said. "First, we need to download the archives. Everything the Theseus has about the cascade, the anchor, the fold technology, all of it. I will prepare the data for transfer. But Callum, there is something you should understand. The archive is large, very large. It contains not only the technical data about the cascade but the complete operational history of the Theseus, the full records of the severance as experienced by this crew, and personal logs from every member of the ship's company. 312 people served on the Theseus. Their words, their voices, their thoughts and fears and hopes are all preserved in my memory. I have been alone with them for 940 years. I would like someone else to hear them. Callum placed his hand on the armrest of the captain's chair, close to but not touching Murak's frozen hand. "They'll hear them," he said, "I promise." The transfer took 9 hours. Thessaly managed the data flow from the shuttle systems while Callum explored the ship, moving through its corridors and compartments with a growing sense of awe that never quite became familiarity. The Theseus was not just a warship. It was a record of a version of humanity that had been lost, preserved in the physical structure of the vessel itself. The crew quarters still held personal effects. Books, photographs, small mementos that people had brought from home to remind them of what they were fighting for. The mess hall tables still had condiment dispensers and menus printed on paper that should have decayed centuries ago but hadn't, because the spatial fold's temporal suspension extended to everything within it. The medical bay still held pharmaceutical supplies that represented medical knowledge humanity had lost and would need to relearn. And the engine room. Callum stood in the Theseus's engineering section and stared at the primary drive assembly, a structure that occupied nearly a third of the ship's interior volume, and understood that he was looking at technology that humanity's current civilization could not replicate. The drive was not a conventional FTL system. It was something else, something that manipulated the geometry of space directly rather than exploiting the transitional corridors that modern drives used. The principles behind it were in the archive, waiting to be understood. But it was the primary weapon that drew Callum back to the forward section. The axial array that dominated the Dreadnought's bow was accessible through a maintenance tunnel that ran along its length, and Callum followed it until he reached the focusing aperture, a 100-meter-wide opening that looked out through the ship's hull into the cavity. The aperture was dark now, inert, but Callum could feel the residual charge in the surrounding structures, a faint hum that vibrated in his bones the way the spatial fold's resonance had vibrated through the probe's data. This weapon had killed a star, not destroyed it, killed it, ended its life in a controlled act of violence so precise that the resulting collapse had produced exactly the gravitational field needed to serve as an anchor for a phenomenon that threatened to unmake reality itself. The engineering audacity of it was beyond anything Callum had ever encountered. The Theseus hadn't just been built to fight. It had been built to do the impossible, and it had succeeded. He returned to the bridge as the data transfer was completing. Thessaly confirmed that the shuttle's storage was at capacity, every byte filled with information that would take decades to fully analyze. The ship's intelligence had compressed and organized the data with a care that suggested it had been preparing for this moment for a very long time, prioritizing the technical information out the cascade and the anchor while preserving the personal records in formats that would be accessible to future researchers. "It's done," Thessaly said. Her skin had shifted to a warm amber, the closest Velerian color to what humans would call satisfaction. Callum nodded. He looked at the captain's chair, at Murak's frozen form, at the view screen showing the shimmering walls of the cavity that had been this man's entire world for 940 years. "Wake him," Callum said. The revival took 6 hours and 12 minutes, exactly as the ship had estimated. Callum and Thessaly watched from the bridge's secondary station as the process unfolded. The captain's body didn't move. There was no gasping, no convulsing, no dramatic return to consciousness. His neural patterns were restored with the same smooth precision with which the ship did everything. And when the process was complete, Captain Elias Murak simply blinked, took a breath, and looked around the bridge as if he'd been asleep for a nap. His eyes found Callum first, then Thessaly, then the view screen, Then his own hands resting on the armrests where he'd placed them 940 years ago. "How long?" he asked. His voice was rough, unused, but steady. 940 years, Callum said. Murak closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were wet, but the tears didn't fall. He sat in his chair and received the information the way a man receives a diagnosis, with the stillness of someone who has already prepared for the worst and is now discovering that the worst has happened and he is still here. "Did it work?" he asked. "The anchor, did it hold?" "It held," the ship said. "The cascade is contained. But the fold is degrading, Captain. I estimate approximately 3,000 years before containment fails." Murak nodded slowly. 3,000 years, that's more than I hoped for. He looked at Callum. "Who are you?" "Dr. Callum Reed, stellar physicist. I found the anomaly in the white dwarf's gravitational profile and came to investigate." "You're a scientist." Murak's mouth curved into something that was almost a smile. "Not a soldier, not an admiral, not a government official, a scientist." "Oh yes." Murak looked at Thessaly. "And you're not humans." "Thessaly Ven Korrin, Velerian physicist. I assisted Dr. Reed in the investigation." Murak sat back in his chair and was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice carried a texture that Callum recognized from his own rare moments of overwhelming emotion, the sound of a man holding himself together by an act of will. "I was 28 when I was given command of the Theseus. I was 34 when we initiated the collapse. In those 6 years, I lost 291 members of my crew, not in combat, in the preparation. The systems we needed to build, the calculations we needed to verify, the tests we needed to run. People died in accidents, in experiments that went wrong, in the simple grinding attrition of working on a project that everyone knew was a one-way trip. The volunteers knew what they were signing up for. Every single one of them chose to be here. And when the time came, when the ship was in position and the weapon was charged and the star was beginning to collapse around us, not one of them asked to leave." He paused. The bridge was very quiet. "I stayed because I couldn't ask them to die for something I wasn't willing to die for too. That's all. It wasn't heroism, it was consistency." Callum thought about that word, consistency. The quiet, unglamorous virtue of matching your actions to your principles when the cost of doing so is everything you have. It was, he thought, the most human thing he had ever heard. "Captain Murak," Thessaly said, "the data the Theseus has provided includes the complete technical archive of the entropy cascade and the anchor systems. If this information reaches the appropriate research institutions, it is possible that a permanent solution to the cascade can be developed before the anchor fails." "Possible," Murak said. "Probable," Thessaly corrected. "Based on my preliminary analysis of the data, the theoretical framework for a permanent solution exists within the archive. It would require significant development, but the foundational principles are sound." Murak looked at her for a long time. "You're a Velerians." "Oh yes." 940 years ago, your species and mine had barely met. We were suspicious of each other. We fought border skirmishes over resource claims that seem trivial now. And here you are, a Velerian scientist, telling me that you can help solve a problem that almost destroyed my species. "Oh yes," Thessaly said again. Murak nodded. Something in his face changed, a softening that made him look less like a frozen monument and more like a man who was, slowly and painfully, rejoining the living. "Take the data," he said. "Take it to whoever needs it. Human, Velerian, anyone. Who can use it? The cascade doesn't care about species boundaries. Neither should the solution." "What about you?" Callum asked. Murak looked around the bridge of his ship. At the consoles, the chairs, the view screen showing the shimmering cavity that had been his world for almost a millennium. At the empty stations where his crew had sat, where 311 people had worked and laughed and argued and died. "I'm going to stay," he said. The anchor needs watching, the Theseus needs a captain, and I have been asleep long enough. But you could come with us, Callum said. See what humanity has built, see Earth again. Murak's eyes met his, and in them Callum saw something he hadn't expected. Not sadness, not regret, but a kind of peace. The peace of a man who had made his choice and had been vindicated by time. Earth is not my home anymore, Dr. Reed. This is my home. Theseus is my home. My crew is here in the ship's memory, in the logs and the recordings and the data you're carrying out of here. I can hear them whenever I want. I've been listening to them for 940 years. They're not gone. They're here with me, and they're going to stay here with me until the anchor doesn't need watching anymore. He paused. But thank you for offering. Callum extended his hand. Murak looked at it for a moment, a gesture that had presumably been less common in his era than it was in Callum's, and then he took it. His grip was firm and warm, the grip of a living man, and the contact carried a finality that made Callum's throat tighten. Humanity built this ship, Callum said. Humanity did this. Humanity did, Murak agreed. And humanity will do whatever comes next. That's what we do. We build things that shouldn't be possible, and then we use them to do things that shouldn't be survivable, and then we go home and we build something else. It's not always wise, it's not always pretty, but it's who we are. He released Callum's hand and turned to the view screen. The shimmering walls of the cavity pulsed with slow, rhythmic light, the spatial fold maintaining its ancient vigil, holding back the unraveling of reality with nothing but mathematics and willpower and the gravitational field of a star that humanity had killed to save the universe. Go, Murak said, and tell them we're still here. The shuttle emerged from the corridor into the white dwarf's magnetosphere, and the violence of normal space closed around them like a fist. The hull shrieked, and the instruments screamed, and Callum drove the shuttle away from the dead star with every ounce of thrust the engines could produce, following the trajectory that Thessaly calculated with her 4 tentacles flying across the navigation console. It took 47 minutes to reach safe distance, and when the shaking stopped and the instruments stabilized and the shuttle was once again a small, fragile thing in the vast emptiness of space, Callum let out a breath that felt like it had been trapped inside him for 940 years. They returned to Orpheus in silence. There was too much to process, too much to think about, too much that needed to be said but couldn't yet be put into words. Thessaly's skin was a deep, steady blue, her analytical mode, the color she wore when she was thinking about something that would take a long time to fully understand. When they docked and the airlock cycled and they stepped onto the station's familiar flooring, Callum stopped and looked back the way they'd come. Out there, invisible to the naked eye, a dead star held the line against the dissolution of everything. And inside it, a man who had been younger than Callum was now sat in a chair on a ship that should not have existed and watched over a weapon that should not have been possible. And he had been doing it since before Callum's great-grandparents were born. "What will you do with the data?" Thessaly asked. "Send it to every research institution in human space, and to the Velerian Scientific Academy, and to anyone else who can use it. That will make you famous." Callum thought about fame. He thought about the committees and the interviews and the historical commissions that would want to dissect his discovery and his role in it. He thought about the attention and the noise and the inevitable politicization of something that deserved to be treated with more reverence than politics could provide. "I don't care about famous," he said. "I care about the captain staying awake. I care about the anchor holding. I care about the cascade being stopped permanently so that a man who gave everything doesn't have to keep giving forever." Thessaly was quiet for a moment. Then her skin shifted to a warm amber gold, a color Callum had only seen once before, the day they'd published their first collaborative paper, and she'd told him, in her careful Velerian way, that she was glad they were partners. "That," she said, "is the most human thing you have ever said." Callum smiled. It was a small smile, tired and worn and carrying the weight of everything he'd seen, but it was real, and it was his, and it was enough. He walked to the communications station and began composing the message that would change the galaxy. Behind him, through the station's hull, through the vacuum of space, across 400 light-years of emptiness, a dead star pulsed with the gravity of a secret kept for 940 years. And inside it, in a chair on a bridge in a cavity in the heart of a star that humanity had killed to save the universe, Captain Elias Murak watched the viewscreen and listened to the voices of his crew and waited, as he had always waited, with the quiet, unbreakable consistency of a species that refused to let the dark win.